grand, sweeping narrative of war, history remembers the generals. It remembers the aces. It lionizes the heroes who charge the machine gun nest. But it almost always forgets the men in the shadows, the greasy, soot-covered, sleep-deprived men who make the war machine run, the mechanics, the technicians, the wrench-turners, the men who are handed a shattered, broken, 30-ton piece of steel, riddled with holes and soaked in the ghosts of its previous crew, and are ordered to make it right by Oro 600. They are the unsung, the unseen, the silent foundation upon which all modern victory is built. But what happens when one of these men, one of these unknowns, sees a truth that the generals and the engineers in their high offices cannot? Tonight's story is about one of those men, an unknown mechanic, a man with no engineering degree, no budget, and no authority, just a welding torch, a boneyard full of battlefield scrap, and a burning, desperate need to protect his brothers in arms. He saw a fatal flaw in their most powerful weapon. His superiors saw standard operating procedure. He proposed a solution. They called it unauthorized, a violation, a waste of resources, and a logistical nightmare. So he did it anyway, in secret, under the cover of darkness. He forged a monster, a machine that was ugly, unbalanced, and a violation of a dozen regulations. But to the enemy who had to face it, it was a terrifying, invincible ghost. This is the unknown mechanic who built a tank that terrified the enemy. Before we fire up that welding torch, if you believe these stories of grit, sacrifice, and battlefield innovation deserve to be told, I need you to secure our perimeter. First, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. It's the only way to support the channel and ensure you never miss a report. Second, hit that like button. It tells the algorithm this history matters. And finally, drop a comment down below. Let us know what country and city you're watching from. It is incredible to see our global community of history and hardware enthusiasts. All right, let's get to work. The cold was a living thing. It was December 1944 in the snow-choked, pine-dark hell of the Ardennes forest, and the cold was a predator. It seeped through wool, through leather, through steel, its icy teeth sinking into the very marrow of the men of C Company, 10th Armored Division. But for Staff Sergeant Elias Scrap Thorne, the cold was secondary. The primary, all-consuming misery was the smell, a constant lingering miasma of burnt diesel, scorched paint, antifreeze, and something else. Something coppery and sweet, the unforgettable stomach-turning stench of burned men. Eli was the motor pool chief, and his world was this smell. His job wasn't just to fix the M4 Sherman tanks that limped back to their makeshift field depot. His job was to cleanse them, to patch the holes, yes, but also to scrape and hose out the interiors, to erase the evidence of what an 88mm shell, or a Panzerfaust, or a Panther's long 75 meters did to the soft human bodies trapped inside. He was a mechanic, a confessor, and an undertaker, all rolled into one, and he was failing. Not as a mechanic. He could fix anything. He could strip a radial engine in the dark in a blizzard and have it running by dawn. He could weld a patch over a fist-sized hole and have it hold. But he was failing to save them. The Sherman, the workhorse of the Allies, was a lie. And in the forests of the Bulge, the lie was being exposed in plumes of thick, black, greasy smoke. The men, in their grim, gallows humor, called it a Ronson, after the lighter's slogan, lights up the first time, every time. The Germans, with even less humor, called it the Tommy Coker. The Tommy Cooker. Eli, standing in the frozen, blood-stained mud of his motor pool, surrounded by the hulks of tanks he had patched just days before, knew the name was accurate. He knew intimately what happened when a German high-velocity shell hit the thin, inadequate, vertical side armor. He knew about the 42 rounds of 75mm ammunition, stowed in the sponsons, right behind that paper-thin plate, turning the inside of the tank into an instantaneous, inescapable inferno. His crews knew it too. The ghosts, the survivors from the tanks that didn't brew up instantly, the ones who had to listen to their friends scream, they would come to his motor pool, their hands shaking, their eyes a million miles away. They wouldn't talk to the chaplain. They'd talk to Scrap. It just popped, Scrap. One young driver, a kid from Alabama named Pierce, had stammered, his face pale, his hands wrapped around a cup of Eli's battery acid-strength coffee. Just pop, not even loud. And then, the fire. God, Eli, the fire. It wasn't red, it was white. And the TC, Sergeant Jensen, he was just gone. He was screaming, and then he was just gone. Eli would just nod, hand the kid another cigarette, and go back to welding the patch on his tank. The sound of the welder's arc, a violent, angry hiss that did nothing to drown out the screams in his head. Then came the call, the one that finally broke him. Viper 3 is hit. Viper 3 is hit, bad. Oh God. They're brewing up, on the road to Bastonia, just south of the crossroads. We're pulling back. We can't get to them. Oh God. Scrap, they're burning. Eli's blood turned to slush. Viper 3 was Sergeant Pete Grizz Rylance, his best friend, the man he had enlisted with back in 41, the man whose kids he was the godfather to. Grizz, burning. He didn't wait for orders. He grabbed his .45, his coat, and roared at his own crew. Saddle up, M32, now! The M32 tank recovery vehicle, a Sherman chassis converted into a heavy-duty tow truck, was Eli's chariot. He drove, not his driver. He pushed the machine through the snow-choked lanes, his knuckles white on the levers, his teeth grinding so hard his jaw ached. He could see the smoke plume from a mile away, a thick, black, oily column against the pristine white winter sky. He found what was left of Viper 3 at the crossroads. It was still burning, a furious, roaring 70-ton pyre. It had been hit, and hit hard, by something that had punched straight through the front. But that wasn't the killing blow. The tank had tried to reverse, to escape, and in doing so, had exposed its side to another unseen gun. The hole in the side sponson, right over the ammo rack, was a tiny, neat, almost polite circle, barely 3 inches wide. The mark of an .88. A fatal, perfect, devastating shot. The fire was so intense, the internal explosions had blown the turret clean off its ring. It sat upside down, 20 feet away in a snowdrift, its 75mm gun buried in the frozen earth, a final pathetic gesture of defeat. Eli Thorne sat in his M32, watching his best friend's funeral pyre, the sound of the distant, retreating battle, a meaningless mosquito buzz in his ears. The cold was gone. The fear was gone. All that was left was a vast, hollow, white-hot rage. He waited for 2 hours, under the cover of his own .50 cal, until the fire died down, until the steel was just barely cool enough to touch, groaning and ticking in the freezing air. He hooked the cables himself. He dragged the blackened, stinking hulk back to his motor pool. And then he did the worst part of his job. He went inside. The interior was not a tank. It was a charnel house, a burnt steel cave, everything coated in a thick, oily black ash that had once been men, Grizz and his crew. 4 men, gone. Eli found what was left of his friend, identifiable only by the melted silver and turquoise Zippo lighter Eli had given him as a good luck charm, lying in the ashes below the TC's hatch. Eli Thorne, a man who hadn't cried since he was a child, a man who had patched up a dozen burnt-out tanks, finally, utterly, broke. He sat in the snow, behind the motor pool tent, the melted lighter in his hand, and he wept. Harsh, ragged, silent sobs that shook his entire body. But as the grief subsided, it was replaced by something else, something harder, resolution. This would not happen again, not on his watch. He would not send another crew out to die in these paper-thin coffins. The book was wrong. The design was wrong. And if the Army wouldn't fix it, he would. He stormed into the company CP, a freezing lamp-lit tent, tracking mud and rage. Captain Wells, the 24-year-old CO who had taken over after the last one was killed, was there, poring over maps. He was a good man, Wells, but he was a bookman, a West Pointer. He believed in doctrine. Sir, Eli's voice was a raw growl. He dropped the melted Zippo on the map table. Wells flinched. That's what's left of Grizz and Viper 3, an 88 side penetration, right in the sponson. They never stood a chance. It's the fourth one this week, sir. The side armor is paper. Wells looked at the Zippo, his face pale. I know, Sergeant. It's tragic, but war is... Don't. Eli cut him off, his voice dangerously quiet. Don't give me the war is hell speech, sir. This isn't war. This is a design flaw. A fatal one. And we are letting it happen. What do you propose, Thorne? Wells asked, his voice stiffening at the insubordination. We're tankers. We rely on speed, on maneuver. What maneuver, sir? Eli shot back. In these goddamn hedgerows? In these forest lanes? There is no maneuver. There's just head on, or get hit in the side. And our sides are worthless. He jabbed a finger at the map. We need armor. Now. I don't care how. Let me weld the spare track links to the side sponsons. Let me take the belly plates off the wrecks and weld those on. No. Wells's voice was flat, cold, final. Absolutely not. Sir? Eli couldn't believe it. Sergeant, Wells said, standing up, the CO pulling rank. I am not going to have my motor pool chief conducting unauthorized field expedient modifications on multi-million-dollar war machines. You will add weight, you will strain the engines, you will overload the transmissions, you will ruin the suspension. You will, in short, create more mechanical failures than you will solve. Your job, Sergeant, is to repair this equipment to factory specifications, not to reinvent it. Eli stared at him, his mind reeling. Sir, with all due respect, what good is a factory-spec transmission when the crew is burnt to a crisp? What good is doctrine when it's getting us all killed? That's enough, Sergeant, Wells snapped. I understand your grief. Grizz was a fine soldier, but letting your emotions compromise your military judgment is not an option. You are a mechanic. You are not an engineer. We are awaiting the new M4A3E2 jumbos from Ordnance. We are awaiting the wet stowage Shermans. Until then, we fight with what we have. Your job is to fix the tanks, not redesign them. Is that clear? He stared Eli down, the captain's bars on his collar glinting in the lantern light. Eli felt the white-hot rage in his chest turn to ice. He saw it, the wall, the real enemy. It wasn't just the Germans. It was this, the book, the rules, the stupidity. Yes, sir, Eli whispered, the words like ash in his mouth. Crystal clear. Get your head straight, Thorne, Wells said, his voice softening slightly, mistaking Eli's cold fury for dejected compliance. Grieve your friend, but then get back to work. Fix the tanks. That's your job. Dismissed. Eli turned, slowly. He walked out of the tent, back into the freezing, moonlit night. He walked past the rows of other Shermans, their crews sleeping fitfully inside, unaware of how thin the steel was that separated them from eternity. He walked back to his motor pool. He stood for a long time, just looking. He looked at the smoking, blackened, ruined hulk of Viper 3, Grizz's tomb. He looked at the melted Zippo in his hand. And then he looked over at his boneyard, the corner of the depot where he kept the wrecks, the unfixables, the scrap. He saw the shattered, captured German Puma armored car. He saw the thick, angled steel plates of a destroyed SD KFZ 251 half-track. He saw steel, lots of it, ugly, enemy, available. Steel. He turned, his face a mask of cold, hard, unemotional calculation. He walked over to his welding shack. He woke up his best welder, a quiet, pale kid from Ohio named Miller. Get your torch, kid, Eli said, his voice a low, flat, dangerous growl. We're working late. What are we working on, Sarge? Miller asked, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Eli looked at the Puma wreck, his mind already calculating cuts, angles, weights. We're reinventing the tank, Miller, Eli said. And we're not logging the hours. This one's off the book. Arthur Croft's office in Hut 14 was less a workspace and more a monastic cell, a dusty archive of forgotten agricultural projections from a world before the war, a world that no longer existed. The room smelled of mildewed paper, stale tea, and the faint, metallic tang of the clattering hand-cranked Monroe calculator that was his only real tool. His official mission, as defined by his perpetually distracted superior, Dr. Peterson, was to analyze potential grain yield failures across occupied Europe, a thin, almost transparent cover story that fooled no one, but was just bureaucratic enough to be ignored. Peterson, a man who saw the war in terms of tonnage and supply, believed the real victory would be won by outproducing the enemy, not outthinking them. He saw Croft, with his quiet intensity and his obsessive, late-night calculations, as a harmless, if eccentric, cog in the great machine, and he largely left him alone. This benign neglect was the first critical ingredient of Croft's hidden project. It gave him the one resource more precious than funding: time, unscrutinized and unaccounted for. His project, the one that truly consumed him, had no official name, no budget, and no authorization. It existed only on the massive cork board-lined wall he had secretly erected, and in the growing forbidden archive of data he was compiling, piece by painstaking piece. It was a project born of a single, cold, terrifying realization. The Allied war effort was bleeding to death in the middle of the Atlantic, and the men in charge had no idea why. He began his work not with equations, but with theft. Not a dramatic spy thriller theft, but a quiet, bureaucratic, insubordinate gathering of data that he was explicitly not cleared for. His work on crop yields gave him legitimate access to shipping manifests and cargo tonnage reports. He started there, cross-referencing the cargo lists of ships that had left port against the lists of ships that had arrived. The discrepancy was a black hole, a horrifying multi-million-ton gap that represented the actual unfiltered cost of the U-boat war. But this was just the what. He needed the where and how. For this, he needed an ally. He found her, not in the halls of power, but in the frantic, clattering heart of the comm center. A Wren, Women's Royal Naval Service, named Mary Thorne, a sharp, fiercely intelligent young woman whose official job was to transcribe and relay the endless, sanitized daily loss reports from the Admiralty. She was the one who typed, "Regret to inform, SS Britannic, overdue, presumed lost, all hands." She was the one who processed the casualty telegrams. She saw the human cost, the names and the families, reduced to cold, procedural text. And it was hardening her, filling her with a cold, quiet rage. She saw Croft, the odd, intense farmer statistician from Hut 14, always lingering, always asking quiet, peripheral questions about shipping routes and weather patterns. She was suspicious at first, then she became curious. "You're not really counting wheat, are you, Doctor?" she asked him one night, catching him in the empty canteen where he was staring, unseeing, at a cold cup of tea, a sheet of graph paper covered in logarithmic spirals in front of him. Croft looked up, his eyes weary, assessing. He saw not just a Wren, but a fellow mind, a person who saw the numbers and the blood behind them. He made a decision. He didn't tell her everything, not at first. "I'm looking for a pattern," he said quietly, "in the losses. It doesn't feel random. It feels systematic. But I don't have enough data. I just have the cargo lists. I don't have the locations. I don't have the U-boat data." Mary, who had just spent her day typing the coordinates of 3 separate sinkings in the mid-Atlantic Gap, a place the Navy brass called the Black Pit, felt a jolt of recognition. "The Black Pit," she whispered. "That's where they're dying. Everyone knows that." "But why?" Croft pressed, leaning forward, his voice intense. "Is it really just a gap in our air cover? Or is it something else? Is it the routes we're sending them on? Are we herding them into the guns? I can't know. Not without the U-boat sighting reports, the decoded transmissions." He was asking her to commit treason, to steal classified, ultra-level intelligence, the decoded locations, though not the content, of German U-boat transmissions, to leak naval casualty reports. He was asking her to risk a court-martial, prison, or worse. Mary looked at this strange, intense man with his obsessive charts. She thought of the telegram she had processed that day. I see what I can do, she said, her voice barely a whisper. No promises, and if I'm caught, I've never met you. Mary became his secret, vital artery. In the dead of night, she would slip him the flimsy carbon copy pages of the raw intercepts. Time, date, grid coordinate. A U-boat had talked from here, a convoy had been attacked there, a merchantman was overdue on this route. It was fragmented, incomplete, dirty data, but it was real. Croft returned to his cell in Hut 14 and began to build. He covered the entire 20-foot-long wall with a massive, detailed, gridded map of the North Atlantic, from the coast of Newfoundland to the shores of Ireland, and he began to plot. He used simple colored pins, a red pin for every confirmed ship sinking, a black pin for every decoded U-boat transmission location, a blue pin for every unconfirmed possible sighting. For weeks the map grew, becoming a horrific, sprawling rash of red and black, a pointillist painting of death. It was exactly what the Navy admirals saw in their own war rooms, a terrifying, overwhelming, random chaos. The black pit was a solid mass of red, confirming the conventional wisdom. It was a needle in a haystack problem. The Atlantic was too vast, the U-boats too numerous. The experts, like the abrasive, dismissive Commander Davies, the official Admiralty liaison to Bletchley, were convinced the only solution was more. More ships, more planes, more depth charges, hunt and kill. An offensive, search and destroy doctrine. But Croft was a statistician. He wasn't just looking at the pins. He was looking at the spaces between the pins. He started adding new layers of data. He got the weather reports from the Met Office. He used green string to mark the boundaries of high-pressure systems, yellow for storms. He saw a correlation, faint, but there. The U-boats were less successful in high seas, in the worst weather. Their periscopes were useless. Their torpedoes' depth-keeping was thrown off. The safe northern route, the one the Admiralty preferred because its chronic fog and storms were thought to provide cover, was actually, statistically, safer. But the Admiralty wasn't using it enough, or at the right times, because they feared the weather as much as the U-boats. Then, he added the most critical layer. He had Mary get him the flight plans for the RAF Coastal Command's anti-submarine patrols. He used white string to lay out their patrol grids. And then, he saw it. The real pattern. The truth, hidden in the chaos. The Admiralty and the RAF were playing a game of chess, but they were announcing all their moves. The patrol grids were fixed. They were flying the same predictable, high-probability routes, day after day, week after week. They were hunting where the U-boats had been yesterday, and the German U-boat commanders, led by Karl Dönitz, who was a brilliant strategist, weren't stupid. They knew. They had broken the Allies' convoy ciphers, too. They knew where the patrols were. They simply weren't. They were operating in the gaps, in the seams, in the statistically safe shadows between the fixed patrol routes. They were letting the convoys, and their escorts, sail right through the safe patrolled boxes, and then attacking them, with impunity, the moment they exited. The Allies weren't hunting the wolves. They were just, very loudly guarding a few specific empty patches of the sheep pen. Croft's mind, the mind of a mathematician who saw the world in probabilities, was suddenly, blindingly illuminated. The entire Allied anti-submarine strategy was wrong. It was reactive. They were trying to find the U-boats, a statistically impossible task in a 3 million square mile ocean. The solution, his calculations screamed at him, was to stop hunting, to stop trying to find the needle. The solution was to protect the hay. No, not even that. The solution was to make the haystack lethal to the needle. He started calculating probabilities, working late into the night, his Monroe calculator clattering like a machine gun, his hands covered in chalk dust as he scrawled equations on a small, hidden blackboard. What if you stopped the predictable patrol grids? What if you took all your available aircraft, all your precious long-range Liberators and Sunderlands, and instead of spreading them thin, trying to find U-boats, you concentrated them? What if you created a box of the ocean, say, 100 miles square, and you saturated it with continuous randomized air patrols, you wouldn't find every U-boat. You wouldn't even try. But you would make that 100-mile box a zone of absolute denial, a 24/7, high-probability killing field where a U-boat could not surface to attack, could not surface to charge its batteries, without a very high probability of a plane full of depth charges suddenly appearing out of the sun. And then you just sailed the convoy right through the middle of the box. It was a fundamental shift in thinking. From offensive, search and destroy, to defensive, probabilistic denial. It wasn't about killing the wolves. It was about building a moving, invisible, lethal fence around the sheep. He called it the statistical denial corridor. It was brilliant. It was revolutionary. And it was, he knew, completely, utterly unsellable. He requested a meeting with Commander Davies, not with Dr. Peterson, who wouldn't understand, but with the naval liaison officer himself. He had to try. He couldn't go to the admirals, but he could go to their gatekeeper. Davies, irritated, gave him 5 minutes. Croft, his voice trembling with the passion of his discovery, rolled his massive, string and pin-covered map into the commander's office. He laid it out. He explained the data, the pins, the strings, the red and black rash of death, the gaps. He explained the failure of the fixed patrol grids, and then he presented his solution. The statistical denial corridor, the randomized saturation patrols. Davies listened, his face, a mask of weathered, seafaring arrogance, slowly turning from impatient to confused to furious. When Croft finished, there was a long, terrible silence. Davies just stared at the map, at the multicolored web of string. "Croft," Davies finally said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Is this a joke?" "Sir?" "A joke," Davies repeated, his voice rising. "Are you, an agricultural statistician, standing in my office, in the middle of a goddamn war, and telling me, a man who has hunted these U-boats from the deck of a destroyer, that our entire anti-submarine doctrine is wrong?" "Sir, the data shows—" "Your data shows nothing." Davies slammed his fist on the desk. "It shows pins on a map. You know what it doesn't show. It doesn't show the guts of my men, freezing to death in oily water. It doesn't show the courage it takes to run down a U-boat in a gale. You academic. You dare to tell me to stop hunting?" "Sir, it's not stopping hunting, it's smarter hunting. It's probability." "It's cowardice," Davies roared, his face purple. "It's a defeatist, academic, coward's plan. You want to hide behind your numbers. You want to tell my pilots, who are risking their lives every day to find and kill the enemy, to just fly around in random squares, hoping the U-boats just go away. It is the most idiotic, insulting, unmilitary piece of nonsense I have ever heard in my life." He swept his arm across the desk, knocking a stack of papers to the floor. "Get this string art, out of my office. Get it out of my sight. And you, Croft." He jabbed a shaking finger at him. "You are done. Your project is over. I am personally revoking your access to all naval intelligence, effective immediately. You are a statistician. You are paid to count wheat. So you go. And you count. Your wheat. Are we clear?" Croft stood there, paralyzed, humiliated. The laughter from the Bletchley Park pool echoing in his ears. He just nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He rolled up his map, his beautiful, terrible map of truth, and he walked out, his project not just hidden, but officially rejected, buried, and forbidden. The rejection was a physical blow. A door slammed in my face so hard it rattled my teeth. Commander Davies, a man whose entire worldview was built on the comforting, rigid traditions of the Royal Navy, of hunting, of engaging, of offensive spirit, had not just dismissed my analysis. He had branded it cowardice. He had looked at my map, a horrifying tapestry of death woven from his own failures, and seen only string art. He had seen the solution, the statistical denial corridor, as a defeatist, academic coward's plan. He had revoked my access, banished me back to Hut 14, and ordered me, with all the venom of a man whose dogma was threatened, to go back to counting my wheat. I stumbled back to my cold, damp hut, the massive rolled-up map under my arm feeling less like a key and more like a tombstone. I had failed. I had seen the truth, a truth written in the cold, hard mathematics of probability and loss, and I had been powerless to make anyone look at it. The laughter from the Bletchley Park pool, the polite, dismissive chuckles of men who knew better, echoed in my ears. I was the fool on the hill, a Cassandra with a chalkboard, screaming a warning that nobody wanted to hear. For a week, I was a ghost. I sat in my hut, staring at the wall where the map had been. I did my official work, running meaningless projections on Ukrainian grain harvests, the numbers of bitter, tasteless ash in my mouth. And all the while, the war raged on, oblivious to my tiny, rejected revelation. The war, in fact, got worse. Mary, my only ally, my secret artery of data, continued to bring me the reports. She was terrified now. Davies's rage had been noted. She knew she was risking everything, not just her position, but potentially her freedom, by continuing to speak to the mad statistician. But she was also angry. The reports she brought were no longer just tragic. They were catastrophic. The U-boat wolf packs, having fully cracked the main convoy cipher, were operating with a newfound, terrifying precision. They weren't just finding convoys in the Black Pit. They were vectoring onto them, organizing mass, coordinated swamp attacks. Convoys SC-122 and HX-229 in March of 1943 were not just battles, they were massacres. We lost 38 ships, over 200 Zarazern tons of an irreplaceable lifeline, in a single, brutal, 72-hour period. The search and destroy doctrine of Commander Davies, the aggressive, offensive patrols. They had bagged one U-boat. One. In exchange for 38 merchant ships, their crews, and their precious cargo. The Atlantic was a graveyard, and we were losing the war. Mary laid the latest loss reports on my desk, her hand shaking. "They're calling it Black May," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The Admiralty. They're in a panic. They're talking. They're actually talking about abandoning the convoy system, just letting the ships sail independently, hope for the best. It's suicide." She looked at me, her eyes filled with a desperate, angry plea. "Your map, Arthur. Your theory. This corridor idea. Are you sure?" I looked at the new bloody red pins in my hand, representing the men and ships of SC-122. I looked at the cold, hard numbers I had rerun, again and again. "I'm sure, Mary," I said, my voice a low, hard knot of certainty. "The math doesn't lie. Their system is failing. It's worse than failing. It's helping the U-boats. It's predictable. It's herding the sheep into a killing field, and then sending the sheepdogs on a wild goose chase miles away." "Then tell them," she hissed. "Show them. Go over Davies's head. Go to the Admiral." "The Admiral listens to Davies," I shot back, the frustration boiling over. "Davies is operations. He's a warrior. I'm the wheat counter. I'm the coward with the string art. He's already poisoned the well. Any report from me will be buried before it ever reaches the Admiral's desk." We sat in silence, the hopelessness a thick, cold fog in the small hut. Davies, the Navy, the Admiralty. They were a brick wall, a wall of tradition, of offensive spirit, of a deep-seated romantic contempt for defensive numbers. But Nanta, my map, it didn't just show ships, it didn't just show U-boats, it showed the patrols, the White String, the RAF patrols, Coastal Command. They were the ones flying the useless, rigid, predictable grids. They were the ones wasting the fuel, the flight hours, the lives on this failed doctrine. The Navy, the Admiralty told them where to patrol in coordination, but the command, the assets. They were RAF. And the RAF, they weren't sailors. They were airmen. They were a different breed. They were a separate service. with their own rivalries, their own budgets, their own internal culture. And I knew from the technical journals I read that the RAF, particularly Coastal Command, was becoming obsessed with a new kind of warfare. Operations research, statistics, probability. They were already using primitive statistical analysis to determine the optimal depth charge settings, the most effective search patterns. They might speak my language. They might listen. Mary, I said, my voice low, the seed of a new, insane, treasonous idea taking root. Commander Davies, he's Admiralty, he's Navy. Who is his equivalent at Coastal Command? Who is the man who hates seeing his planes wasted? Who runs their operations research? Mary's eyes widened. She understood instantly. Oh, God. Arthur, you can't. That's not just bypassing the chain of command. That's going to another service, behind the Navy's back, if Davies finds out. If we don't do this, Mary, I countered, my voice hard, we lose the war. Who is he? She hesitated, then nodded, her face grim. Shaw, she said. Group Captain Harrison Shaw, head of 19 Group's Ops Analysis. He's based at Northwood. They say he's a data man. Brutal, efficient, hates the Admiralty, thinks their search and destroy doctrine is a criminal waste of his aircraft. He's been fighting them for months, trying to get his planes retasked for direct convoy support, but Davies and the admirals keep overruling him, insisting on offensive hunting patrols. It was him. It was the crack in the wall. A man who already believed the current strategy was failing. A man who believed in data. A man who hated the very admirals who had rejected me. It was perfect. I spent the next 2 days creating a new, smaller, portable version of my analysis. Not the giant, incriminating map, but a series of precise, devastating charts. Convoy losses versus patrol grid proximity. U-boat transmission clusters versus RAF patrol gaps. Statistical probability of detection. Fixed grid versus randomized saturation. I was packaging my string art into the cold, hard, irrefutable language of mathematics. Mary, at immense personal risk, arranged the meeting. It was off the books, a chance encounter at a pub near Northwood, a place known to be frequented by Coastal Command staff. I felt like a spy, a traitor, my heart hammering against my ribs, my briefcase chained to my wrist, containing the data that could either save the war or send me to the Tower of London. I found Shaw in a quiet, dark, smoke-filled booth. He was a tall, thin man with weary, intelligent eyes and the impatient, restless energy of a man who had too much to do and not enough time. He didn't shake my hand. "You're Croft," he said, his voice a crisp, upper-class clip. "The wheat man from Bletchley. Mary Thorne said you had something. Interesting. You have 10 minutes before I have to be back for the night briefing." I didn't waste time. I opened the briefcase. I laid out the charts. "Sir," I began, my voice shaking slightly, "I'm here because I believe our current anti-submarine patrol doctrine is not just failing, it is actively helping the enemy, and I can prove it." Shaw raised an eyebrow, skeptical but intrigued. "Go on." For 10 minutes I talked. I laid out the data. The U-boat kill rate versus patrol hours flown, abysmal. The convoy loss rate in patrolled zones versus unpatrolled gaps, staggering. I showed him the pattern, the fixed, predictable grids. "They know, sir," I said, my voice intense. "They know where we are. They know where we will be. They are simply not there. They are waiting for our liberators to fly their useless straight lines, and then they are surfacing in the gaps in broad daylight, to run at high speed on their diesels, to get ahead of the convoys, to set up their ambushes. We are not hunting them. We are, effectively, giving them a schedule." Shaw was silent, his eyes locked on my charts, his knuckles white around his glass. He wasn't laughing. He was vibrating, with a cold, suppressed intellectual fury. "I knew it," he whispered, his voice a low, savage growl. "I knew it. I've been screaming at the Admiralty for months that my patrols are seeing nothing, that my planes are being wasted. Davies, that arrogant sea-bound idiot. He keeps telling me it's about offensive spirit, about keeping the pressure on. He's not keeping the pressure on. He's wasting my bloody aeroplanes. He looked at me, his eyes sharp, predatory. Okay, Croft. You've diagnosed the disease. What's the cure? Don't tell me more planes. I don't have any more planes. No, sir, I said, pulling out my last, most important chart. Not more planes. Smarter planes. Or rather, a smarter system. I call it the statistical denial corridor. I laid it out. The 100-mile wide box, saturated with randomized patrols, moving with the convoy. I explained the math. The probability of detection for a surfacing U-boat inside that box. It wasn't 10%. It was 70%. Maybe 80%. It was a statistical meat grinder. Shaw listened, his skepticism returning. A box. A defensive box. Around the convoy. Croft, that's just a glorified escort. We've tried that. The Navy does that. It doesn't work. We need to be out there hunting. No, sir, I insisted, my voice passionate. That's what Commander Davies said. He called it cowardice. He's wrong. It is not an escort. It is a trap. Shaw looked confused. A trap? Yes, sir. Think of it from the U-boat's perspective. He's not afraid of the convoy escorts. He can see them. He can dodge them. He's afraid of you. He's afraid of your long-range liberator, appearing out of the sun when he's blind, on the surface, charging his batteries. Right now, he surfaces in the gaps, where he knows you aren't. But with this system, the gap is the convoy. The safest place for him to be is miles away. But he can't. To attack the convoy, he must enter the box. And the moment he enters that 10,000 square mile box, he is no longer in an ocean. He is in a cage patrolled by a dozen aircraft flying random, unpredictable patterns. He can't predict where you are. He can't surface to run at speed. He is forced to stay submerged, slow, blind, crawling at 2 knots on his batteries while the convoy steams past him. And if he does get desperate, if he surfaces to charge, to sea, he has an 80% chance of being detected and killed. It's not a shield, sir. It's an ambush. It turns the convoy itself into the bait for a massive 10 statistical killing zone. Shaw was silent for a long time, staring at my probability chart. He saw it. He saw the brutal offensive logic hidden inside my defensive package. He saw that it wasn't cowardice. It was lethal. The Admiralty. Davies. They will never approve this, he said finally, his voice a low growl. They are wedded to their hunter-killer groups. They see this as taking my planes away from the offensive fight. They are losing the war with their offensive fight, sir, I whispered. Shaw stood up, pacing the small pub booth. He was at war with his own side. Okay, Croft, he said, his voice a low, conspiratorial rumble. I can't change the entire Atlantic strategy. I don't have that power. Davies would have me relieved of command. But I do have operational control of No. 19 Group flying out of Cornwall and St. Eval. We fly the Biscay patrols. He looked at me, his eyes gleaming. The Bay of Biscay, the U-boat superhighway. Every single U-boat leaving France has to pass through that box. It's not a convoy. But the principle of saturation. We could test it there. We could stop flying our predictable patrol lines, and we could create a statistical nightmare for every U-boat commander who tries to transit. It was a desperate, highly illegal, inter-service conspiracy. A group captain in the RF and a rejected civilian statistician from Bletchley Park plotting to run a secret, unauthorized test of a radical new doctrine in direct violation of Admiralty policy. Sir, I said, my heart hammering. It will work. The math is sound. Your math better be, Croft, Shaw growled, stubbing out his cigarette. Because I am about to bet my entire career, and the lives of my men, on your string art. Go back to Bletchley, keep your head down, and get me the patrol vectors. Randomized, optimized for probability of detection, and pray to God You're as smart as you think you are. The pact was sealed in the smoky, ale-stained darkness of that pub, a conspiracy of two, an RAF group captain betting his career, and a civilian statistician betting his freedom. I returned to Bletchley Park, to my cold, damp cell in Hut 14, a changed man. I was no longer just a wheat counter. I was the secret, hidden nerve center of the most critical, unauthorized military experiment of the war. My life became a meticulous, paranoid, double existence. By day, I dutifully and poorly generated nonsense reports on hypothetical grain yields, enduring the dismissive, pitying glances of my superiors, my very presence a reminder of Commander Davies's authority. Dr. Peterson, my official boss, barely spoke to me, clearly having been warned that I was a lost cause, a man whose career was circling the drain. But by night, my hut became the operational planning cell for the Battle of the Bay of Biscay. The risks were immense. Mary Thorne, my quiet, courageous ally, was now committing inter-service espionage, smuggling RAF operational plans out of Bletchley and classified naval intelligence in. She would bring me the raw data, U-boat intercept plots, the Admiralty's latest convoy routing, weather projections. Her hands shaking, but her eyes steady. Her belief in the project a silent, powerful fuel. They lost another 6 ships last night, she'd whisper, placing the flimsy reports on my desk. Close support escorts were overwhelmed. The hunter groups found nothing. Again, that was all the motivation I needed. I worked with a frantic, feverish intensity. My Monroe calculator clattering like a machine gun in the dead of night. My hidden blackboard a chaotic symphony of equations, probabilities, and vectors. I wasn't just creating a plan, I was creating a new form of warfare. I generated the patrol vectors for Shaw's number 19 group, not in predictable grid-like sweeps, but as a truly randomized, overlapping, saturated matrix. I used random number tables, weighted by U-boat transit probabilities and historical sighting data. The goal was to create a 100-mile-wide statistical nightmare, a box of ocean where, at any given moment, a surfacing U-boat commander had no idea if a plane was 5 minutes away or 5 hours away. The old doctrine was predictable, like a cop walking the same beat every night. My doctrine was chaos. It was a swarm of cops appearing at random at all hours. I'd pass the vectors to Mary, who would encode them, disguised as meteorological data requests, and transmit them through a secure, non-naval RAF channel directly to Shaw's operations room at Northwood. It was treason. It was a statistical insurgency. And for the first week, it was a terrifying, silent failure. The first 5 days of Shaw's Bay offensive were the worst of my life. The reports that trickled back, forwarded by Mary, were a stream of monotonous, agonizing, no sightings, NIL contact, patrol completed as vectored, NIL results. Shaw's pilots, the weary veterans flying the long-range Liberators and Sunderlands, were furious. They were being pulled from their offensive hunter-killer sweeps and ordered to fly these bizarre, seemingly pointless, overlapping random patterns over an empty bay. They were convinced their group captain had gone mad, seduced by some civilian boffin's insane theory. I could picture Shaw in his operations room, his career hanging by a single fraying thread, staring at his empty kills board. I could imagine Commander Davies back at the Admiralty, surely hearing the rumors of 19 Group's bizarre new flight plans, a slow, predatory, satisfied smile spreading across his face. He was just waiting for the failure. He was waiting for the convoy loss reports from the Atlantic to spike again, proving his offensive doctrine was right, and that Shaw's and my defensive folly was a disaster. I was on the verge of cracking. I was sitting in my hut on the 6th night, staring at my useless map, convinced I had made a catastrophic error in my calculations, that I was about to be responsible for the loss of hundreds of ships and the end of Shaw's, Mary's, and my own life. When the first message came in, it was a single, coded flash transmission, forwarded by Mary, not from the Admiralty, but from 19 Group. Vector 12, contact, U-boat, surfaced, attacking, sunk. My heart stopped. I stared at the words, sunk. One of my random probabilistic vectors had placed a liberator directly on top of a U-boat that was brazenly surfacing at night, assuming it was safe in one of the old gaps. An hour later, another message. Vector 09. Contact. 2 U-boats. Surfaced. Attacking. 1 sunk, 1 damaged. Forced to dive. Then another. And another. By the morning of the 7th day, my desk was littered with them. It wasn't a trickle, it was a flood. Shaw's pilots, who had been hunting for weeks without a single sighting in the open Atlantic, had, in 12 hours of flying my crazy patterns over the bay, attacked 7 U-boats, sinking 4 of them. It was a massacre, and it was a statistical massacre. The U-boat commanders, led by Karl Dönitz, were not fools. They were creatures of habit and calculation. Their entire strategy for transiting the Bay of Biscay was built on predictability. They knew where Shaw's fixed patrols were, and they knew where they weren't. They would surface at night, in the gaps, and run at high speed on their diesel engines, recharging their batteries, getting to the Atlantic hunting grounds fast, fresh, and fully charged. But now, there were no gaps. My randomized, saturated patrols had turned their safe superhighway into a 24/7 killing field. A U-boat surfacing anywhere in the bay now had a high quantifiable probability of finding a 400 lb depth charge barrage landing on its head. The German U-boat command, in their bunkers in Lorient, was thrown into absolute blind panic. Their safe transit zone had, overnight, become the most dangerous place on Earth. They didn't know why. They couldn't see the pattern, because there was no pattern. It was pure, lethal, weaponized randomness. Their reaction was immediate and desperate. Stop surfacing. All U-boats were ordered to transit the bay submerged, crawling at 2 knots on their batteries. What had been a 24-hour dash was now an agonizing 7-day, 8-day crawl, blind, deaf, and burning their precious battery life before they even reached the battlefield. And the moment they finally cleared the bay, battered, their crews exhausted, their batteries on the verge of death, they were forced to surface in the open Atlantic, in broad daylight, to recharge. Right in the middle of the Black Pit, where the Allied convoy escorts and carrier groups were waiting for them. It was the unintended and utterly devastating consequence of my plan. I hadn't just created a trap in the Bay of Biscay. I had starved the wolf packs in the mid-Atlantic. The effect on the Battle of the Atlantic was not gradual. It was instantaneous. It was a collapse. The Black May of 1943, the month the Allies nearly lost the war, the month 38 ships went down in 2 convoys, was followed by a miracle. In June, losses plummeted. In July, they plummeted again. The wolf packs, which had been sinking ships at will, were suddenly silent. They were starving, arriving on station late, batteries dead, crews exhausted, and being picked off one by the now effective escort groups who were finding them, crippled and desperate, on the surface. The hunter-killer groups that Davies so loved were suddenly finding targets. But the real killing, the source of the victory, was happening hundreds of miles away, in Shaw's Bay offensive. Shaw's 19 group, in a matter of weeks, sank more U-boats in the Bay of Biscay than the entire Allied search and destroy effort had in the previous year. The U-boat arm was being strangled at its source. The kill ratio didn't just change, it inverted. The hunters had become the hunted, and it was all because of a statistician and his string art. The confrontation, when it came, was not in a pub. It was in the High Command War Room at the Admiralty. Commander Davies was there, his face pale, presenting a chart showing the inexplicable collapse of U-boat activity in the mid-Atlantic. He was trying to take credit, attributing it to his aggressive offensive patrols finally paying off. And then, Group Captain Harrison Shaw, who had been invited, stood up. He didn't have string. He had a single, brutal chart. U-boat kills, by location. And the bar graph for the Bay of Biscay. It went off the page. "It seems, Commander," Shaw said, his voice a cold, precise drawl, "that while your men were hunting in the Atlantic, my men were killing in the Bay, using a new doctrine, a probabilistic one. Perhaps you'd like the man who invented it to explain it to you. I was brought in, not to a pub, to the war room. I was terrified, my old, rumpled-suited disgrace among the gold braid and naval whites. But this time, they listened. I unrolled my map. I laid out my charts. I explained the math. I explained the statistical denial corridor. And this time, no one laughed. Commander Davies, he just sat there, his face the color of ash, silent as his entire world was dismantled, piece by mathematical piece. My coward's plan was adopted, not just for the Bay, for the entire Atlantic. The hunter-killer groups were retasked. The convoys were given direct, massive, saturated air support, flying in my randomized statistical boxes. My hidden project became the core doctrine of the entire anti-submarine war. The Battle of the Atlantic, the single most important campaign of the war, turned. It turned not on a new weapon, not on a new ship, but on a single, rejected, statistical idea. Alistair Croft, the forgotten statistician, the wheat counter, the man who used pins and string, had done what the entire Royal Navy's command structure could not. I had solved the riddle. I had saved the convoys. In the title, the hidden project that changed the future of World War. It was the end. My project. It was the beginning of the end for the U-boat wolf packs, and it remained, until the end of the war, the single most important secret we had. A secret hidden in plain sight. A secret hidden in the math.